Code located inside widgets is hard to reuse, and furthermore, you often end up cluttering up the lifecycle methods such as initState with a lot of code. You'd love to keep true to the single responsibility principle, but how when Flutter doesn't let you? Enter Flutter Hooks, a way to separate your UI logic into independent and composable hooks that will instantly improve code sharing, cleanliness, and thus also maintainability. Hello, welcome to the Reso Coder, where you are getting prepared for real app development so that you will get freelance clients or a job and be confident about the apps you build. So subscribe and hit the bell to join us on our quest for becoming in-demand Flutter developers. By the end of this tutorial, you will know how to create this kind of a floating action button, which whenever you scroll the list view is going to get hidden, and then as you scroll up, it's going to reappear. And of course, you can build this with just pure Flutter stateful widgets, but we are going to build all of this using Flutter Hooks. And of course, we have a starter project so that you do not have to implement the basic functionality using the classic stateful widget approach yourself. So practically, by all intents and purposes, we already have the app working. All we need to do is to migrate it from stateful widgets to Flutter Hooks. And you can get this starter project from the link in the video description. And also that link contains the written tutorial where you can also find all of the code written in this video, links to the libraries, and overall go through this lesson at your own pace. First up, let's go over this application as it is implemented now without the use of Flutter Hooks. You should know a little something about animation if you want to continue, and I have a separate tutorial about animation which you can check out from the card in the corner. What we currently do is that we have a stateful widget called homepage, and inside it we have a list view and also a floating action button. And we are hiding this floating action button with a fade transition and also a scale transition using an animation controller right here. And how is this all implemented? What are we doing in order to control the showing up and hiding of the floating action button? Well, we use a scroll controller on the list view. And what's happening with these two controllers? Well, we first, because we are using a stateful widget, we need to have them defined as state fields here. So we have a scroll controller and also animation controller. Then we mustn't forget to dispose of them whenever the state is disposed. This is pretty important. And then of course inside initState, we set the controllers to be new instances. Animation controller needs to take in some sort of a vsync, which is a ticker provider. And if you know something about animation, you know that you can provide a ticker provider by mixing in the state object with, for example, a single ticker provider state mixin. So you can immediately see how the boilerplate is just adding up. But let's for now just continue with how it's implemented currently. So once we have the scroll controller and also animation controller instances all set up, we also set the duration of the animation and set the floating action button to be initially visible by setting it to 1. If we set it to 0, it's gonna be initially hidden, of course. And once we have that, we then just listen on the scroll controller, and whenever the scroll direction changes, we are going to animate the floating action button's controller. So if we take a look, when we scroll forward in the forward direction, which means scrolling up, we will show the floating action button. If we scroll in the reverse direction, so that is down, we're going to hide the floating action button. And if the scroll direction is idle, so no scrolling is happening, as you can see, we don't change the state of the floating action button's animation, so we just leave it as it was previously. Alright, so this is really it, but as you can see, there is a lot of boilerplate here in this homepage state class, and also we have just really tightly coupled these two fields to this particular widget. That's because with stateful widget, which we are currently using, we have to keep the controllers as fields inside the state class. That's because we need to initialize them here in initState and dispose of them in the dispose method. So with the current approach, there is just no way to move these controllers to some different class. Even if we did, we would still need to override dispose and override initState and initialize and dispose of them right here in this widget, or more precisely in its associated state class. And of course, we could at least extract this call to add listener to some sort of a helper function, some static method in some class, but that's about it. We simply cannot get rid of most of the boilerplate which we can currently see. And in addition, having so much code inside one class hinders readability, especially if you need to add more state to it down the line. So for example, if we also wanted to add some sort of a text editing controller later to this class, we would have already 3 controllers here and it would just become a mess really quickly. So while with Flutter really everything is possible, you can put any kind of code inside your stateful widgets, wouldn't it be just better to have the logic and also this setup code elsewhere and have only practically stateless widgets all throughout the app instead of having stateful widgets? And this is where Flutter Hooks comes in. Although we cannot mark all of our widgets to be stateless, we can get pretty close to that by making them hook widgets. So first, let's go to pubspec YAML and we are going to add Flutter Hooks to dependencies. Its current version is 0.7.0, and because I cannot promise that there aren't going to be any breaking changes, if you want to follow along with this tutorial, make sure to use the same version, but you may be also all well if you use a more up-to-date version in the future. So once we have Flutter Hooks, we can go to homepage and let's discuss how they actually work. Well, they work very much like the state objects of stateful widgets, but there is one important difference. You can have only one state object associated with one widget. There is just no way to have multiple states for one stateful widget, as you know. But with hooks, you can have multiple hooks for one hook widget, and all of those hooks can hold some sort of a state. For example, our scroll controller and also animation controller. There are a bunch of predefined hooks which we can use, and one of them is for animation controller. So we do not need to write any of our own logic in order to grab an instance of animation controller. However, there are also instances where you need to define hooks yourself. For example, with our scroll controller, there is just no predefined hooks for getting it. So this animation thing, which I am demonstrating in this tutorial, is really the perfect use case for learning Flutter hooks. We need to create one custom hook and we can also use one predefined hook. The first thing you need to do when you migrate to Flutter hooks is to get rid of your stateful widget and instead use a hook widget. So let's actually just altogether delete our home page here, and we are going to make the state into a home page, and it's not going to extend state, but instead it's going to be the hook widget. And it's no longer even going to be mixed in with single ticker provider state mixin. We don't need to provide the ticker because the predefined hook, which can grant us an animation controller, provides the ticker to the controller itself. Let's just for now ignore this scroll controller because we need to define our own hook. But before we do that, let's just focus on the predefined hook for getting the animation controller. So we first can delete the animation controller because we aren't going to keep any state in the homepage hook widget. All of the state will be handled by the hooks. So we can remove the dispose call to it. Again, we are just leaving scroll controller intact because we will want to copy this code to our custom hook later on. Of course, we cannot initialize this stuff in initState. Actually, initState is not even present inside a hook widget, which is kind of obvious. So we can remove also the supercalls. So now we don't have any field inside the class for the animation controller. So how are we going to get it? And how can we animate something with it? Well, we're going to use the hooks. So we want to use animation controller, and we just need to provide again a duration for the animation. So k theme animation duration. And then this takes in initial value. So again, we want to make it visible by default because we want to show the floating action button at first before the user scrolls. So if we take a look at the definition of this function, or at the signature actually, we can see that it returns animation controller, which is just what we need. So we can now store it inside of final hide FAB anim controller. And now we can use it by removing the underscores from the previously mentioned field. And now we can use this animation controller just as before, but we get it by calling use animation controller, and we do not need to do any setup in our state of the stateful widget. But how does this even work? It works in the same way that stateful widgets and their states work. Just instead of keeping one state per stateful widget, hook widgets keep a list of hooks. And when you call those hooks in a defined order all the time, so for example, there are also other hooks like use state and use stream and so on. So final test hook. And if you call something like this, the hook widget will grant you the instance of the thing in question which you are requesting by calling the use method. And then it's up to these hooks to handle initialization with initState and also disposal with the dispose method. You don't need to do any of that because these hooks, if we just briefly take a look, do that for you. Here you have dispose, and it disposes animation controller for you. Here you have, for example, build, and it initializes the animation controller for you. And the same goes with the ticker, which we don't need to provide to the animation controller. It creates the ticker for you. It disposes the ticker for you. Everything is done for you. You don't need to do anything. Basically, you can think of hooks as if you were creating a bunch of small and very focused state objects which are associated with a stateful widget. All right, so we have this predefined hook sorted out. We can now use it throughout our widget code to provide it to the fade transition and also the scale transition. But what about our scroll controller? How can we create a custom hook for that? Well, all we need to do is to just move this logic from initState and also from dispose to another place. And we will also need to pass in the animation controller to that place, for example, to a function, because we no longer have access to the animation controller by the virtue of these two fields being in the same class. They're going to be separated now, so we need to be able to pass in the animation controller to the scroll controller's hook. So let's create a new file with the simplest form of hook, and we are going to create it under lib, new folder hooks. And let's create a new file there. It's gonna be called scroll controller for animation. So again, the simplest form of hook is really just a function. This function will need to return a scroll controller because that's what we want to get at the end, so that we can provide it to the list view here. So let's create such a function right now. Scroll controller will be the return type. So let's call it use scroll controller for animation. And it's gonna be taken in an animation controller, and I'm not sure why it imported Cupertino. Let's just make sure that we import material here. And in this function, we can just copy whatever code we currently have inside the home page, which currently is completely broken. So we're gonna have a scroll controller in that function without underscore, because we are just inside function. We don't need to hide it from anything. And we want to set it equal to a new scroll controller instance. So let's do just that. All right. So we have the first part already translated from the stateful widget to this hook. Secondly, we will need to set the listener for this scroll controller. So let's cut it out. And we are going to call scroll controller add listener, remove all of the underscores, import Flutter rendering for the scroll direction. And now the animation controller needs to be the one which is passed in. So again, nothing changes. We just change a bunch of names and that's about it. Still pretty simple. We now have all of the code which is inside initState. Then we can return the scroll controller, and that's fine, but we cannot dispose. Like, how can we dispose of the scroll controller? We cannot dispose of it here because that would automatically unregister all of the listeners, so we wouldn't do anything with the scroll controller in the end. So we need to find a different way to do this. But for now, let's pretend that not call and dispose is not a problem. And if we pretend that everything is fine without call and dispose, we can remove all of the code which currently just throws errors at us. And now we can use our scroll controller and put it inside a final scroll controller. And we are gonna call use scroll controller for animation. And we are going to pass in the hide FAB anim controller. So what this means is that now this animation controller for hiding the floating action button is going to be controlled by our own custom scroll controller. So now we can pass this scroll controller to the list view to be the controller, save that, and now we can run the app and scroll. Yay! We can see that it hides, and that's a very nice thing to see. But again, let's not forget about the dispose call, which we currently do not do. So functions are elegant, functions are awesome, but hooks created as simple functions as we did here just cannot be aware of the lifecycle of their underlying hook widget. So this means that whenever you instantiate some sort of a controller or stream controller or whatever which needs to be disposed, you cannot just create a simple function for the hook. You can create functions whenever you do not need to dispose anything or in other way be aware of the widget lifecycle. And you can read more about that from the official documentation for Flutter Hooks, and a link to that is also in the written tutorial. So the bottom line is, because we need to be able to know about the widget lifecycle and dispose of this scroll controller inside the dispose callback method, we cannot just create a function. Instead, we need to have a fully blown hook class. If you're familiar with stateful widgets and their state classes, so basically if you know the basics of Flutter, this following code which we are about to write should come to you very naturally. There are gonna be just a slight naming changes, but the structure will remain the same. Let's just for now leave this functional hook in here so that we can copy code from it. And I have a little hack. So I currently do not have a code snippet specifically for creating hook classes, but we can use the snippet reserved for making stateful widgets. So stful, let's call it with underscore. We want to make it package private. You're gonna see why in just a bit. Let's call it scroll controller for animation hook. All right, once we have that, we're gonna remove the duplicate underscores for the associated hook state. So let's just remove that. Of course, I could also rename it, but whatever. And of course, this cannot be a stateful widget. Instead, it's going to be a hook. So what should this hook hold? Well, this hook should provide a scroll controller. And now this associated state will not be a state as is standard with Flutter, but instead it will be a hook state. Fairly simple indeed. And there is one more type parameter which we need to specify for hook state, which is this R, and that is the thing which should be provided, which is this scroll controller. All right, so the first type parameter is for the thing which you should provide to the UI, and the second type parameter of hook state is its associated hook class. The last thing which we're gonna change in this basic scaffolding is the return type of the build method. It's not gonna be a widget, but instead the scroll controller, which should be provided. And that's it. Now, we need to be able to pass in an animation controller to our hook. And similar to how you pass in things to a stateful widget, the same applies to hooks. You need to pass in objects to the hook, and then you can use those passed in objects from the state. Let me demonstrate. So we need to pass in this animation controller. So let's just copy and paste that to be a field, and let's populate it in a constructor. So let's just say generate constructor. If you don't have the Dart data class extension, you are really missing out. So install that and you can use the same shortcuts as I'm using. But anyway, you just need to create a constructor. Let's also make it constant for good measure, because we can actually make this animation controller to be final. And if you want to learn everything you need to know about constants in Dart, check out the tutorial from the card in the corner. And as I said, similar to how you can use the fields defined inside the stateful widget from the state class, in the same way you can use fields defined inside the hook in the hook state class. So we can say hook dot animation controller, and now we have an access to it. So that's nice, but what do we want to do in this hook state class? Well, we're going to do the same thing we were doing in the home page when it was still just a stateful widget. Inside init hook, which is a variation of initState, we actually don't need to call the super.init hook because it's just empty, so we don't need to do that. Unlike with states in stateful widgets, where you do need to call the super method. And here again, all we want to do is to instantiate a new scroll controller. But because we are again inside a class, we cannot afford to have a scroll controller like this, where we instantiate it inside this method. We again need to have it as a class field. So let's do just that with an underscore scroll controller. And now we can set equal the scroll controller to be a new instance of scroll controller. And let's again add underscores everywhere where they are needed, because just below this instantiation, we again add a listener to the scroll controller. So really we are just moving the same logic around. Before it was inside initState, and now it's inside init hook. And if this seems like too much to process, you can always go through the written tutorial at your own pace from the link in the video description. So in order to access the animation controller, we need to get whatever is inside the hook class. So hook.animationController, which will grant us this one. And we need to do the same in the other case of the switch statement. That's awesome. Once the scroll controller is initialized inside init hook, we then want to return it from the build method. So let's just say scroll controller. And what we actually came here for is the dispose method. Again, we do not need to call super.dispose because it's just empty in its implementation. So we can remove that call. And from here, all we want to do is to call scroll controller dot dispose. So as you can see, hooks are nothing scary. They are really just a variation on stateful widgets, but you are going to mostly make them more focused. You are not going to probably keep a bunch of fields in just one hook. You are instead going to branch out into multiple hooks, and that's because the hook widget can use multiple hooks and not just one state. Alright, so why did we make this class package private? Which means that we currently cannot access it from the homepage hook widget. Well, we did that because there is a bit of boilerplate which you need to call whenever you want to use a proper hook class. So instead of putting this boilerplate directly inside home page, we are still just going to call use scroll controller for animation, which will hide this boilerplate in this function. So what do we want to do here? We want to call hook.use and now provide the instance which we want to use. So this is going to be the scroll controller for animation hook. And also we will need to pass in the animation controller. And that's it. So because we did not change the public interface and also we did not change the functionality basically, except for the fact that now the scroll controller is really disposed, we don't need to do any changes to the homepage hook widget because it still just calls this use scroll controller for animation method or function because it's outside the class. And because of this, we can just run the app again, take a look at it, and of course it's still going to work very nicely. And you may argue that we have just added a lot of boilerplate. I mean, this is just crazy. And you are correct. Hooks are not a silver bullet, and you have to constantly weigh other factors when you decide whether to use or not to use hooks. For example, using a hook only in one widget, as we are doing now, is completely ludicrous, doesn't make sense, and it's not a good time investment. However, if you have 10 of these kinds of widgets, or even just 3 or 2 widgets which need to hide their floating action button, then using a hook like this, which we have just created, is very much beneficial. So you really need to weigh the pros and cons whenever you want to use hooks. Of course, when you can use a predefined hook, like with this animation controller, just use it always. Do not even think about that, because when something is already there for you, you don't need to invest more time into implementing that hook. Why not? Why not to use something which will make your life easier? I know that this tutorial may be a bit more on the advanced side, especially with all of the hook code we have written here. So if you want to go through this at your own pace once again and to get all of the code, check out the written tutorial available from the link in the description. And also, if you are serious about becoming a great Flutter developer who can build real apps for clients or at the job, go to flutter.education, link is also in the description, to get the top curated Flutter news and resources aimed at improving your app development career. Over there you can also subscribe to my mailing list to get the best Flutter resources delivered weekly right into your inbox. And if you don't want to miss more tutorials like this, be sure to subscribe to this channel and also join the notification squad by hitting the bell button to make sure you grow your Flutter skills, because here on ResoCoder I am determined to provide you with the best tutorials and resources so that you will become an in-demand Flutter developer. If this video helped you with understanding Flutter hooks, how to implement them, how to use the predefined ones, give it a like and also share it with other developers who will surely benefit from this too. Leave a comment if you have anything to say, and see you in the next video.